Battle of Gaza, 312 BCE. Demetrius of Macedon, the besieger of cities, has unleashed his corps of 13 war elephants into the Ptolemaic line. It's the decisive moment, his gamble to defend Syria from the allied forces of Ptolemy and Seleucus, commanders of Alexander who were all but kings of Egypt and Asia Minor. But though the allied army outnumbers him, Demetrius has fought them to a standstill. Both sides have broken their cavalry lances and now fight with swords. Infantry lines crush down on each other, and both Ptolemy and Seleucus are in the combat themselves. In storm the line of elephants. Unstoppable titans, each carrying a small fortress keep on its back loaded with archers. The monsters thunder toward a formation of Ptolemy's light infantry. But Ptolemy was with Alexander in India, and he has faced elephants before when Perdiccas tried to cross the Nile, which is why he hasn't used light infantry in his center, but a specially trained anti-elephant unit. They darken the sky with a swarm of arrows and javelins, heaving spiked caltrops ahead of the line to pierce the war beast's feet, while deploying spiked obstacles linked by chains, which all do the trick. An elephant rears in shock and pain, spilling its archers from the howdah. Another entangles on the chain obstacle and falls, rolling over and crushing the men on its back. Then light infantry swarms them like ants on an injured, dying swallow. A horn calls retreat, and in an instant, history turns. For millennia, men will speak of a Ptolemaic empire and a Seleucid empire. But though he and his line will later be kings of Macedon, none will ever speak of a Demetrian empire. This historical tale is brought to you by one of our favorite card game empires, Doomlings. But more on that, new expansions, and these adorable little chaos gremlins after the episode. In many ways, Ptolemy could be considered the anti-Alexander. Alexander the Great was all about speed and vigor, right? Personal charisma and battlefield command. He was also just all momentum. Like the moment he took a city or toppled an empire, he was just itching to drive on to yet greater achievements. His ambition was such that he also frequently left pockets of resistance in his conquered territories, leaving the mopping up for others rather than consolidating his wins. And famously, his drive for conquest only ceased when his exhausted commanders, Ptolemy very much included, refused to march or fight any longer. Though somewhat ironically, the moment Alexander died, they all decided that actually they were happy to fight just, each other for several more decades in order to try and make themselves head of the empire. But Ptolemy's ambition was not so grandiose as Alexander or his fellow successors. He was cautious, conservative, and a bit older than Alexander. Ptolemy wasn't a gambler. He was not a man to bet more than he could afford to lose, even if there was a possibility for massive gain. Case in point, in the multi-decade wars of the Diadochi that followed his theft of Alexander's body, Ptolemy was smart enough never to bet the crown of Egypt, even if it could have meant winning Macedonia. It was likely that Ptolemy understood that the conquests of Alexander were just too large to be governed by one man. And even if he did take Macedonia, it would have been hell to hold it from his power base in Egypt. Which is not to say that he pursued an entirely defensive strategy. Instead, he built a large navy and focused on acquiring coastal territories, in hopes of trying to turn the Mediterranean into a Ptolemaic lake. Over the decades, he'd invade and seize Syria whenever it appeared weak, before eventually retreating or getting forced back across the Nile. And for a time, he seized Cyprus and got a foothold in coastal Greece and Anatolia before Demetrius, the besieger of cities, man, Macedonians have cool names, rallied his own ships and smashed the Egyptian fleet. Ptolemy, with his natural caution, took in this lesson and further doubled down on his policy of ensuring that he'd secured his power base in Egypt. While he'd further engage with the wars of the Diadochi, he did so through diplomacy, coalition building, and financial assistance to others. Never after Gaza did he command an army, and never after the campaign in Greece did he accompany a military expedition. In fact, when Alexander's heir, Alexander IV, and his mother Roxana were murdered by their supposed protector, and the entire empire started brawling about who would be the new legitimate heir, Ptolemy decided to stay out of it. Because here's the real interesting thing. See, Ptolemy seems to have had a quality that is very underrated in leaders. Say it with me now. Self-reflection. He had a good grasp of his strengths and weaknesses, and while he was an excellent organizer, bureaucrat, and logistician, he was at best a middling field commander. So in a very un-Alexander-like fashion, he focused on securing and building up what he had, rather than trying to capture what he didn't. Man, Rob, this is like really your kind of guy, huh? Because like I'm more of an Alexander type where I'm just like, go, 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 but I don't really think about what's behind me, and you're always doing the planning and the thing. I guess what I'm saying here is, do you like want to go on campaign after lunch? Sick, let's do it. Let me finish the script up though. But Ptolemy could afford to be cautious, because out of all of the Diadochi, he really was in the best position. First of all, Egypt was one of, if not the richest satrapy Alexander conquered. I mean, it had the Nile, and because of its seasonal flooding, the territory could produce 3 grain crops per year. Given that it was Macedonia's strong agriculture that built its military, Ptolemy understood how powerful that could be for both trade and defense. Besides, since the Persians had never undone the Egyptian bureaucracy during their period of rule, merely adding their own efficient flourishes to it, Ptolemy could tweak and reform existing structures rather than building them from the ground up. In fact, the previous 30th dynasty and the Persian occupiers that succeeded it had already started to introduce currency on a small scale, which was at the top of Ptolemy's list. Actually, not long after the Battle of Gaza, around 311 BCE, Ptolemy started minting gold, silver, and copper coins to replace the mix of mostly Greek currencies circulating in Egypt. These had Alexander's face on them, as did all the coins minted by Alexander's successors in the early years, to emphasize Ptolemy's connection to the great man and claim the title of Alexander's true successor. Also, around that time, he declared Egypt to be a closed monetary zone, meaning that, like most nations today, you had to conduct business in local currency. This not only meant that Ptolemy could keep control of the money supply, but he could also charge a percentage on merchants exchanging foreign coins upon entry, as well as taxing their imports and other trade activities within the kingdom. Plus, this helped with one of the few trade goods that Egypt actually lacked, which was silver. Rather than importing, Ptolemy could increase his supply by taking in foreign coins during the exchange. He paired that monetary policy with a tight reform of tax and revenue collection, making sure that the government got a cut on market activities and businesses, such as beer, cloth, and papyrus producers within the satrapy. With all this new revenue, he poured funds into using new irrigation methods to drain marshes and redirect water flow away from the Nile to increase the crop yield Egypt could produce. Meanwhile, he imported new strains of crops that were more valuable in the Mediterranean trade, such as durum wheat, while bringing in varieties of wine grapes to begin producing the Macedonians' preferred beverage, which, unlike beer, could be exported without spoiling. Also, he massively built up his new Greek-style capital of Alexandria. It was to take the crown from Memphis as the greatest city in Egypt and transition the kingdom from one that focused on the Nile and the Red Sea to one that was oriented toward the Mediterranean. While it would be famous for its scholars, Alexandria was first and foremost a port city, tying it to Greece, Anatolia, and the other developing states and kingdoms that had started sprouting in Alexander's wake. And to show that he was founding a new center of this developing Hellenistic world of Greek culture, he created the Museion, a sort of university, museum, and collection of texts that would become better known as the Library of Alexandria. To increase its book collection, law dictated that any text that came ashore in Egypt must be copied for its preservation and stored there. And you can learn more about that in our Hypatia of Alexandria series. Ptolemy also personally sponsored the mathematician Euclid to complete his best-known geometry text, The Elements. However, once it was produced and Ptolemy tried to read the volume he'd spent so much money on, he found it totally impenetrable. Then when he complained it was too hard to understand, Euclid, perhaps playing on Ptolemy's fame as a builder of public works, joked that he couldn't make it simpler, saying, quote, "There is no royal road to geometry." Sick burn! But all of these actions did set up a question. Who would be running all this tax collection, these public works, these universities? Well, Macedonians and Greeks. Ptolemaic Egypt would be a strict caste system, with Greek speakers at the top, and Ptolemy's court was exclusively Greek. Similarly, most landowners were Greeks, as well as the officials running the new system of districts and smaller divisions of land down to the village level. Ptolemy invited Greeks from across the Mediterranean to resettle in Egypt to become tax collectors and bureaucrats, many working for him directly since he personally owned half the agricultural land in Egypt. Ultimately, somewhere around 5% of the population would be Macedonian and Greek. They would hold all positions of political power and engage in the thriving market and trade economy from the Mediterranean, while the vast majority of Egyptians worked as subsistence farmers. Which, when you think about it, seems like it was just sort of asking for a rebellion, right? Well, you guessed it. The Ptolemaic dynasty would become very practiced at putting down uprisings by the Egyptian majority. But it's important to note that Ptolemy wasn't outright rejected for a number of reasons. For instance, religion. While the Persians had been hostile to Egyptian religion, Ptolemy and his successors would go out of their way to patronize it, revitalizing temple construction and producing traditional works of Egyptian art. Ptolemy personally patronized the Egyptian priesthood, the one area where native Egyptians were allowed to hold power, and ensured that his policies of Hellenization would not interfere with worship, festivals, and religious rites. Which is why the priests all got behind Ptolemy when in 305 BCE, in response to other Diadochi declaring themselves kings, he took on the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt and declared himself Ptolemy I Soter, or Savior. This came along with a religious push. Already, Ptolemy had been building a cult of veneration for Alexander, but this was augmented by Ptolemy and his family taking on the divine mantle of the pharaoh. Similarly, he announced a new state god, Serapis, a combination of Apis and Osiris, but in the form of a bearded underworld god in the Greek tradition, likely based on Hades. And geez, how does one simply announce a new deity? I mean, that keynote speech must have been fire, and this was way before the turtleneck was invented. But, he's Ptolemy for a reason. And while during Ptolemy's lifetime, the Greek, Hellenistic, and Egyptian cultures existed in parallel, they would increasingly cross over with one another in later years. As the centuries passed, Egyptian-style queen statues would have curly Greek hairstyles, or Athena-like owls would adorn temple walls. Paintings on mummies would start to resemble Greek portraiture, and the faces of statues softened to an appearance more like statues in the rest of the Hellenistic world. At the same time, the lines between Egyptian and Greek people began to blur. Given that Greek was a distinction based on language, within a few generations, a segment of the, quote, Greek population were actually Greek-speaking Hellenized Egyptians. In his final years, Ptolemy made his son and heir Ptolemy II regent, and retired to write a history of Alexander's campaigns. Though that has not survived, it did inform several later histories of Alexander's conquests, and is generally considered to have been accurate, apart from burnishing Ptolemy's credentials and, smearing Perdiccas. Ptolemy died in his mid-80s and was deified by his son. His heirs would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries, continuing many of his policies and even taking some further. Ptolemy II would build the famous Pharaoh's Lighthouse of Alexandria and move Alexander's body to a magnificent mausoleum in the capital, where it would become a center of worship, an emblem of power, and his body a ghoulish tourist attraction people gawked at for centuries. He also followed in his father's lead by keeping up appearances for the sake of Egyptian religion. Not only would he be carved and represented as a traditional pharaoh in religious art like his father, he decided to become like the pharaohs of old and married his full sister Arsinoe II. Though this was in line with Egyptian royal behavior, it shocked the Ptolemaic court, leading him to have a poet who criticized him assassinated, though the marriage itself may have only been for show, since the couple had no children. But it set a pattern for later Ptolemaic rulers who would go on to practice sibling marriage. And like his father, he captured outposts in the Mediterranean and tried to dominate Syria, a regular pastime for Ptolemaic rulers. Though there was one other way Ptolemy set a precedent for his line. His family politics were messy as all get out. He'd married 4 times in his life, twice in Egypt, and had possibly even practiced polygamy. Only his children from his 4th wife, Berenice, became the Ptolemaic line of Egypt. His first group of children, with Berenice's cousin Eurydice, were reputed along with their mother and went abroad. 2 of those sons, including one named Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, man, seriously, best names ever, would briefly make themselves kings of Macedon. In fact, before Arsinoe II married Ptolemy II, she'd been married to her half-brother, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt. But while queen of Macedon, she'd plotted against him and had fled to Egypt. Double sibling marriage! This tradition of scheming, backstabbing, and messy family relationships would become common among the increasingly inbred descendants of Ptolemy, and would serve to destabilize the kingdom just as Rome was beginning to rise as the new Mediterranean power, and that time period you can learn all about in our Cleopatra series. And when that occurred, when Caesar came ashore and met the renegade queen Cleopatra VII, what he saw was a city like those in Greece. A crown jewel of the Mediterranean, with its port, its library, its radiant lighthouse, and a mausoleum to a legendary conqueror. Caesar beheld Alexander's Egypt, which is so interesting to think about, because if there's one thing that I've learned while making this series, it's how an empire's various traits evolve over time to either create something new or send it careening towards catastrophe. 2 things that our friends over at Doomlings know a little something about. So glad you asked, bud. Okay, stop me if you've heard this one. You sit down for your weekly gaming group, but no one can decide what to play. Some are feeling a rules-heavy crunchathon, some want a light game with minor story elements, and some just want the game to start. If you can't tell by my tone, that's usually me. Well, I am very glad to have found something that's been keeping everyone at my gaming table happy for the past year, Doomlings! A lighthearted, cheeky card game that has the easy setup of Uno and the whimsical feel of Pokemon, but also has strategic components that add tons of depth and replayability. Heck, I've even pitched it to people as sort of a Magic the Gathering light. AKA, it's great at keeping all types of players happy. And that's because Doomlings focuses on having fun together, by playing cards to evolve the traits of these adorable little Doomlings over the ages before the world ends in catastrophe. They even have a Doomlings in 60 seconds video that can onboard everybody super quick so you can spend less time learning and more time playing. Or like me, getting into all of the awesome expansion packs, because I have really been enjoying expanding my Doomlings universe. So, to help you get started, or to help you expand your pre-existing Doomlings family, for a limited time you can head to doomlings.com and use our code EXTRA20 to get 20% off your entire order. All you gotta do is click or scan here to invite the Doomlings to your gaming table, and then once you've played a trait or 2, check out our next video here. A legendary thanks to Angelo Valenciana, Dominic Valenciana, Friso Fansanton, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuyakoi, Lotus Wolf, and Ziliad's Architectures for being the best legendary patrons.